Have you heard of breeding children? As the saying goes, you reap what you sow. The children in our village are all grown. If a newlywed man wants a child, he has to go to his mother-in-law's house to beg. Afterwards, bury half of the bride's body in the soil and plant it. After a while, the bride will grow tree buds and bear fruit, and then the child will come out. My brother is getting married this year, and my sister-in-law is the village beauty of the neighboring village. I heard she went to school. Uncle Liu from the village always teases my brother. When he meets him, asking when he plans to have children, my brother chuckled twice. It's almost here, just these 2 months. Sister-in-law is not happy. What kind of child? I told you not to believe in those crooked things. After saying this sentence, I suddenly saw a flash of light in Uncle Liu's eyes. The light looked like a wild wolf that had been hungry for several days in the back mountain, and its face was particularly ferocious. I was so scared that I took a few steps back, as if I had stepped on someone's foot. As soon as I turned around, I found that the light in my father's eyes was even more frightening, and I was about to bow my head when I saw him. I quickly turned my gaze elsewhere and pretended to look at the scenery, but I felt my dad staring at me all the time. I silently walked to the kitchen and caught a glimpse of Uncle Liu approaching my father and whispering. I immediately perked up my ears. Uncle Liu covered his mouth with his hand. Lao Li, you have to watch the good seedlings this time. Don't be like Yingzi. It's a pity. Dad nodded. Don't worry. We will definitely get good seeds this time. Sakola is my mother, and my brother's wedding day has come. My sister-in-law was brought over in a paper red sedan chair. Because of heavy makeup, she looks even paler than the time I saw her before, just like those paper figures in the ancestral hall. I dare not think too deeply, so I said hello and hid behind my mother. One worship to heaven and earth, to worship to the high hall, husband and wife, worship each other, and send them to the bridal chamber. Everyone started laughing and eating, and the surroundings seemed peaceful and lively. But I didn't pay attention to these things. I just felt surrounded by fear. When the couple bowed to each other just now, I clearly saw that my sister-in-law's eyeballs were pure black. How could they be eyeballs that a living person would have? I swallowed my saliva and tugged at my mother's clothes. Did you see my sister-in-law's eyes? Perhaps I didn't lower my voice, and several ants around me also heard what I said. They stopped their chopsticks and inserted them straight into the rice, like incense inserted during a sacrifice, staring at me expressionlessly. A gust of cold wind blew, and I was immediately frightened and at a loss. Mother quickly tapped my forehead. Don't listen to Niuzi's nonsense. She was excited all night and couldn't sleep, so tired that her brain couldn't work. I quickly covered my mouth and nodded. Yes, what I want to say is that my sister-in-law is very beautiful. The ants finally pulled out their chopsticks, and the dining table returned to its previous peaceful scene. In the evening, my mother pulled me into the room and fiercely poked my forehead with her fingertips. You are really brave. Don't ask questions that shouldn't be asked in the future. I covered my forehead, feeling a bit wrong, but I really saw it. Mother stared at me for a few seconds, and suddenly pulled me into her arms with love. Remember, no matter how strange things you see in the future, you must pretend to be normal. My sister-in-law agreed to go with my brother to beg for seeds, and the whole family was very happy, especially my father, who got up early and sat at the door smoking dry tobacco, showing off to everyone. The people in the village were not angry, but instead grinned and showed a pleasing expression. Lao Li, if the remaining flowers are useless after the child grows them, can you give me a few? Dad nodded with a smile, squeezed out a string of wrinkles on his face. No problem. He will make soup for everyone to replenish it later. It has to be our Liege. He is generous. Then I'll just wait for the news. When the auspicious time came, the brother and sister-in-law began to count off 5 times and 3 times from the moment they stepped out of the house. Their expressions were particularly devout, and they knelt with extra force. When they passed by me, I even felt the ground shaking. After a while, my sister-in-law's forehead was covered in blood, but my brother's forehead was surprisingly fine. Their voices didn't sound like they were made by humans. They were extremely sharp. Shaman, shaman, please give us seeds. I remembered my mother's words and followed closely behind without daring to make a sound. The group arrived at the shaman's residence, and the sky instantly darkened. A dry hand lifted the door curtain, which reminded me of fried chicken feet, and my stomach was filled with acid. This is the first time I've seen a shaman. She's even shorter than me, just over a meter. She muttered something in her mouth, pointing one hand to the sky and the other to the ground. Finally, she brought out a dark red broken bowl from the house and put it in front of my sister-in-law's mouth. The gods have felt your sincerity. This is your seed. The sister-in-law nodded and drank the bowl directly from the shaman's hand. I tiptoed curiously and watched. In the moment my sister-in-law turned around, a drop of bright red liquid flowed down her mouth. She looked in my direction, slowly opened her mouth, showed a smile, and her teeth were dyed red. The fortune teller nodded satisfactorily, then pulled the throat that seemed to be stuck with thick phlegm and continued speaking. You should pay attention. This is your only child. You must return home naked and offer sacrifices for 49 days. She pointed to my sister-in-law and said, during this period, you cannot eat anything, especially anything with blood. The most important thing is to be careful not to be peeked at by others, as the gods will be angry. The words of the shaman echoed in my mind. How could a person bear not eating for more than 40 days? I became more and more curious about what kind of child it was. Time flies, and in the blink of an eye, it's the 49th day. The only news I got was that the child has been planted, but I didn't see my sister-in-law's figure. Curiosity is like a paw constantly scratching my itchy flesh. I really want to take a look, so when everyone is asleep, I quietly get out of bed. The yard was pitch black, and I couldn't see my hand. Just as I was secretly happy that no one had noticed me, a black shadow suddenly appeared in front of me. Not sleeping so late. What are you planning to do? It's my dad's voice, maybe because the night is too dark. I can only see his eyes, and other parts seem particularly blurry, so I could only pretend to sleepwalk, look straight ahead, mutter, and go back to the room. The next day after waking up, I shook my mother, who was still sleeping, and told her what happened last night. But I lied and didn't say that I wanted to peek at the child planted by my brother and sister-in-law. Instead, when she heard our horse barking, My mother widened her eyes and quickly covered my mouth. She poked her head out of the room and looked twice. She breathed a sigh of relief when she saw no one passing by. "Mom told you. Why didn't you listen? You have to pretend you didn't see anything." After speaking, he leaned close to my ear and whispered, "If you see a dark person in the future, imitate the sound of a horse." This time I firmly remembered what my mother said, but the seeds of curiosity had already been planted, and I secretly ran out quietly along the way without encountering anyone, and gradually relaxed. My brother and sister-in-law's house has built a new wall, and there is a piece of land in the courtyard surrounded by red gauze with a person standing in the middle. I quickly lay on the wall, afraid of being discovered by him, but after a long time that figure never moved. Maybe I was dazzled. I quietly climbed down and walked quietly against the wall without making a sound. Finally came in. My heart was pounding, holding my breath and reaching out to lift the veil. The scene I saw next seemed to freeze all my blood. Sister-in-law was planted in the ground, and the soil was buried up to her knees. Her eyes stared straight ahead. Her face was pale, and, upon closer inspection, there was a hint of youthfulness. One by one, the branches broke through her skin, drilled out of her body, and extended in all directions. Each branch was dark red and had thorns, as if wrapped in a layer of dried blood. The thickest one grew from the top of her head and even sprouted, looking like it was about to grow flower buds. It turns out that planting children is not planting seeds, but people. I didn't care if it was the same hands and feet. I ran towards home, and the surrounding houses were rapidly retreating until I couldn't catch my breath and didn't get home. My heart skipped a beat when I came. The road didn't seem that long, and there was a rustling sound behind me. Dad's voice came over. "Why hasn't Niuzi come home so late?" I was so excited that I wanted to respond, thinking that I was finally saved. Just before turning back, there was another voice behind me. "Niuzi, my mother just woke up and found that you were not by her side, which scared her. Let's go home." The rustling sound came closer and closer, and I felt a cool breeze blowing in my ear, which turned out to be my sister-in-law's voice. "You are a bad boy, a bad boy." I instinctively turned around and saw no trace of my father and mother. There was only a flower behind me that was as tall as a person, and the stamen part was my sister-in-law's face. Just then, I remembered my mother's instructions and quickly learned to bark like a horse, and everything in front of me suddenly spun. I blacked out, and when I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in the yard. Just breathed a sigh of relief, accidentally looked up at the position of the wall, and a huge flower poked its head out. That face smiled when it saw me, and I saw it clearly. It was someone else's face, not my sister-in-law's. I stood still, my scalp tingling. There are as many lives as there are flowers. I dare not think too much, and after learning to bark again, the strange phenomenon completely disappeared. The next day, I was woken up by my mother and gradually put on my clothes to go visit him. The first one we went to was my uncle's house. My uncle went out to greet us, and he smiled, rolled up his sleeves, and reached out to take the gift from my mother. A gust of wind blew, and I seemed to smell a bad odor, and everything in front of me was blurry. I rubbed my eyes and looked in the direction of my uncle again. Where is my uncle's figure? In front of me is clearly a giant flower, exactly the same as the one I saw last night. I was so scared that I ran around and rushed out the door. At that moment, I clearly saw my uncle smiling at me, his teeth stained red, just like my sister-in-law that time. When I got home, my mother gave me a bag of seeds. They were not small in size, but soft, round, and rolled around when I pinched them. Mother took a rope and tied it around my neck, stuffing it into my clothes. This is specially requested by your mother for you. It can ward off evil spirits. If you bring it with you every day, nothing will happen. I couldn't help but reach out and pinch it again. It was quite elastic and seemed to be some kind of liquid inside. Counting the days, the child planted by my brother and sister-in-law is about to bear fruit, and I haven't seen those huge flowers for a long time. She gradually disappeared from my memory, as if there was no intersection anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it was a nightmare I had. I looked up and felt surprised, curious why there were white lanterns hanging outside the window when this was clearly a happy event. I asked my dad standing by the door, and he gave me a meaningful pat on the head. You'll know when the time comes. I shook my head and stopped thinking about it, and started counting the number of people who came to congratulate me. It's the first time I've seen so many people come to my house. Although we all know each other, we shouldn't be that close. Uncle Liu stood in the front, picked up the basin in his hand, waved it in the direction of my father, and nodded with a smile. At this point, I noticed that everyone was either holding pots and pans or stuffing red plastic bags in their pockets. I whispered to my mother next to me, "Is this kind of flower really that delicious? Why are we all waiting here?" After listening to my words, my mother immediately changed. Her expression glared at me fiercely and gritted her teeth. "Who told you that flowers can be eaten?" I overheard it. When Dad and Uncle Liu were talking, I overheard them. Seeing such a mother, I am a little scared, and I don't know why she suddenly got angry. She pointed at me with her index finger, trembling slightly because she was angry. "You are not allowed to eat things made of flowers. Do you hear me? I feel very wrong, but I dare not say anything." I thought to myself that if I were not allowed to eat, I would steal it. Suddenly, there was a cheer in front of me. I tried to tiptoe and saw my father and several other uncles carrying something out on a bamboo mat, wrapped in a layer of red cloth, which looked very heavy. I wanted to say a few more words to my mother, but found that she was gone. A horse was standing quietly eating grass on the side. I couldn't find my mother's figure, so I followed my father all the way home. They carried the heavy object all the way into the kitchen, and I was about to follow, but my dad kicked me out. He glanced at me. His eyes were different from before. "Don't come in, kids. I'll save you the most delicious one later." I stood at the door, listening with my ear against the window, and a dull sound of chopping meat came from inside. Isn't it strange to say flowers? Where did the meat come from? Could it be that Dad bought it to celebrate? My mouth began to secrete saliva. After all, I haven't eaten meat for too long. After a while, it quieted down inside, and a strong fragrance came out. I had never smelled that kind of fragrance in my life, unlike any kind of meat I had ever eaten. It was a sweet and floral taste. but I didn't seem to see them bring the flowers back. Uncle Liu was the first to come out, holding a machete with blood dripping on it. A gust of wind blew, and the piercing cold made me shiver. He smiled and showed me a set of yellowed teeth. "Niuzi, you can eat flowers and drink soup soon. Don't worry." His gaze towards me was not like that of a fellow villager, but more like that of a lamb. I lowered my head and casually responded a few words. "Okay, Uncle Liu." After smelling the fragrance, familiar faces from the village rushed over, causing me to stumble and almost fall. Their eyes were like fierce beasts, full of red blood vessels, as if they hadn't slept for days. They lined up, and Uncle Liu went in and brought out a large bowl of meat, which was almost overflowing. The people around looked at him with envy, and I heard the sound of swallowing saliva suddenly. Uncle Liu didn't go home immediately. Instead, he squatted at the door and started eating. The bowl was steaming hot and looked very odd to the touch. He grabbed the meat crazily with his hands and put it in his mouth. After chewing it a few times, he swallowed it with a loud swallowing sound. Then he gulped down the soup as if he hadn't had enough. Uncle Liu stuck out his tongue and licked the bowl again, not sparing the remaining bones. He held them in his mouth for a while and then chewed on the bones. At this time, my father came out with a bowl of soup, handed it to me with a smile, and said, "Drink it while it's hot. There are also 2 of the tenderest pieces of meat in it. The good things are all left for you." I took the bowl, feeling a bit lost. My intuition told me that something might happen if I drank the soup, but my father's gaze became sharper and sharper, making me shudder. So he gritted his teeth, picked up the bowl and handed it to his mouth, blew a few times, and took a bite. "Dad, it's still hot. I'll cool it down and drink it later." He seemed to not believe it, and I picked up a piece of meat, blew it into my mouth, pretended to chew it, and looked intoxicated. My father finally felt relieved, and after confirming that he had walked into the kitchen, I spat out the meat that had not been swallowed. A strange taste spread in the mouth, and after grabbing a few bites of the cucumber planted in the yard, the taste slowly dissipated. I walked to the outskirts of the yard, tugged at my aunt's brother's clothes, and mixed the soup and meat in the bowl for him. He immediately showed a surprised expression, and his mouth almost reached his ears. "Niuzi, you are such a good person. If anyone dares to bully you in the future, just come to me directly." I nodded and handed the bowl to my dad in the kitchen. When he saw that I had finished eating, he smiled and patted my head. "You're so good, go play." I accidentally glanced at the empty bowl. It was a different color from the other bowls, dark red, and I felt like I had seen it somewhere before. "What are you thinking?" Suddenly got hit on the top of your head. "Nothing much. Dad, what kind of meat is this? Why is it so fragrant?" He showed a meaningful smile again, just ordinary pork with some mushrooms added. After stepping out of the kitchen, I thought of my brother and sister-in-law. My sister-in-law had just given birth and always had to visit. I don't know why. My parents never mentioned this, so I secretly rejoiced in my carefulness and walked slowly towards the house where my brother and sister-in-law lived. The more I walked, the more I felt something was wrong. That is clearly the bowl of the shaman.